Hello everybody and welcome to the Whiskey Dictionary, where I do the research to try to teach you a little something about what you're drinking. Today I'm going to be talking about Knob Creek Kentucky Straight Bourbon. This bourbon can be found in almost every bar, so let's find out why. I've already talked about the Jim Beam distillery more than a few times, so I'm not really going to dwell on that. So instead I'd rather talk about what makes Knob Creek special. Now this is a small batch from Jim Beam, similar to Booker's or Baker's or Basil Hayden's. And because of that, you should know that small batch doesn't really mean much, especially not when you're dealing with the volume that something like Knob Creek or Booker's or Baker's or any of those are really dealing with. There's a ton of it. And small batch should imply a small number of barrels that when you blend them together, you come up with something that is sellable. In the case of Knob Creek, I'm sure that there's something to it. I'm sure they're selecting, specific barrels to go together, but we've got to be talking about hundreds of barrels in order to put out the volume that Knob Creek is. So small batch is not a federally regulated keyword. So in other words, it's just marketing. So one thing to keep in mind though is that Knob Creek is something that's in every single bar. And because of that, you might remember that this made my beginner bourbon buying guide. And other than the fact that the bottle itself is kind of striking, you notice it on the shelf for sure. It takes up just the right amount of room. It's a little smaller than some of the other bottles. And in general, next time you go to the bar, see if you can pick it out like right away. I guarantee you that it will be one of the first that you notice. So the reason that I picked it as one of those beginner bourbons is, although it's 100 proof, that makes it really versatile because the flavor itself of this thing, as we're going to find out in a minute here, is very good. And because of that, it works really well neat, it works well with ice, it works well with water, it works well as a mixer. In fact, it's what I use in my Manhattans. And it's just very, very versatile. So anyway, Knob Creek has several different offerings that they do. They do the Kentucky Straight Bourbon, they have a rye, they have a barrel strength, and then they have a smoked maple. Let's talk about the nosing and the tasting of this guy. So I was able to get my hands on the mash bill for Knob Creek, which is 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% barley. And because of that, we're gonna end up with a very sweet whiskey with just a hint of spice probably at the end, and possibly a little bit of earthiness from the barley. So let's let this breathe for just a sec. And it's a nice, very, very nice dark color. I actually ended up getting just a little bit of wax in here, so I'm watching that float around. Doesn't really matter. So, all right, let's give this a nose. So there's a very subtle burn if you inhale a little too deep, so keep that in mind. But outside of that, the nose itself is fairly unremarkable. You've got a very strong amount of oak in there, and then maybe a little bit of caramel coming out the back. But it's really not anything special, as far as the nose goes. I actually think that might have something to do with its popularity. If you think about things that tend to get extremely popular, they're usually pretty average in a lot of ways. That way they can be acceptable to a lot of people. So, all right, let's go ahead and go into the tasting. So, cheers. So I'm happy to say I did not get any of that wax in my mouth. So the flavor here, you've got kind of like Vermont maple syrup hitting you right off the bat. And that might be why they decided to do a smoked maple. Maybe they were getting that themselves. Mixing the maple syrup with the bit of rye that comes out of it and just a lot of oakiness. The rye is more at the finish, and there is an alcohol burn. So if you wanted to add a little bit of water to this, you would not be remiss to do so. I think you would, me personally, I tend not to, but I think you could very well add some water to this and have it taste a little bit different for yourself. I personally found it just kind of diluted it, but I don't know. Maybe I drink too many high alcohol whiskeys. Anyway, let me tell you about what my opinion of this whiskey is. I love this whiskey. I think this whiskey is a stock it 100% of the time. This is something that is consistently in my bar, and I've gone through a few bottles of this since starting the channel. Actually, since probably like a year and a half or so, I've probably gone through like 2 or 3 bottles of this. So this is something I constantly keep around. I absolutely think that you should keep it around. There's a reason that it's in every single bar. It's absolutely delicious, and because of how useful it is in virtually every scenario that you could have whiskey, it's just a kind of a no-nonsense, I mean, no-brainer, you know? I mean, I think this bottle is like $35. It's not even expensive. So that does it for this episode of the Whiskey Dictionary. Absolutely go out and buy yourself some Knob Creek, and thanks for joining me. Have a good rest of your day. Cheers.